Hi everyone. Okay, so this is your video lecture on Chapter 6, Learning. So if you want to turn to page 200 in your textbook, that is where it starts with classical conditioning. Okay, so I'm going to turn along with you in my textbook on page 200. If you've opened your PowerPoint lecture, which I encourage you to do so, and to use that as a guide when reading through your textbook chapter. So your PowerPoint lecture lets you know what you need to pay attention to within your textbook chapter. So if you've opened up your PowerPoint lecture, you'll see that there are three basic types of learning. There's non-associative learning, associative learning, and learning by watching others. So what I'm going to talk about in this video lecture and what I talked about in Adobe Connect Live during our class time today is associative learning. Okay? So associative learning is learning by association. So if you look on page 200, you see there's something called classical conditioning. So classical conditioning, okay? That word conditioning means learning. So conditioned means learned. To condition means to learn. Conditioning means learning. So when you see that term condition, it means learn. Okay? So classical conditioning is learning by association. Now there's this famous experiment in classical conditioning by researcher Ivan Pavlov called Pavlov's dog. Maybe you've heard of that term, Pavlov's dog, or maybe you haven't. But Ivan Pavlov was the original researcher to really study classical conditioning, and he actually stumbled upon classical conditioning. So Ivan Pavlov was originally interested in why dogs salivate. So he wanted to measure saliva or drool, which I don't know about you, but that would not be something I would be interested in studying. Salivation, saliva, drool, any of that. But Ivan Pavlov was interested in measuring saliva. So he would bring in dog food to the dogs in his research lab, and then he would measure the amounts of saliva that each dog would produce. So Ivan Pavlov would bring in dog food, the dogs would salivate. Bring in dog food, the dogs would salivate. He'd bring in dog food, the dogs would salivate. He'd bring in dog food, the dogs would salivate. Okay? So the unconditioned stimulus was the dog food. Stimulus is something that stimulates or something that produces a behavior or brings on a behavior. So the unconditioned, meaning unlearned, stimulus, something that brings on a behavior, was the dog food. The unconditioned or unlearned response to that stimulus was salivation or drool. So it was unconditioned because it was unlearned. You do not have to teach a dog to drool to dog food. It's an automatic biological process. So the unlearned, unconditioned stimulus, dog food, unconditioned response, salivation. Okay, you're going to see these terms, unconditioned stimulus and response, conditioned stimulus and response on page 201 of your textbook, so follow along. Okay, so Pavlov then noticed one day that the dogs were salivating, but there was no dog food. So he found that the dogs were salivating to the sound of a bell, where your textbook says a metronome. Okay, so why would these dogs salivate to the sound of a bell? Pavlov was curious. Why are they salivating to the sound of a bell? They just salivate to dog food. So why now are they salivating to the sound of a bell? So the door that Pavlov had to walk through to deliver their dog food had a bell on it. So every time Pavlov walked through that door, the bell would make a sound. So he'd walk in to take dog food, the bell would sound. He'd walk in to take dog food, the bell would sound. He'd walk in to take dog food, the bell would sound. So the dogs learned that the sound of the bell meant food was coming. So the dogs therefore learned to salivate to the sound of the bell. The bell was paired with dog food so many times before that the dogs learned that the bell and dog food go hand in hand. The bell and dog food are the same thing. The dogs learned, because the bell and dog food had been paired so many times before, the dogs learned that these two things go together. So now the dogs are salivating to the sound of the bell. Conditioned stimulus or learned stimulus, the sound of the bell. Conditioned response or learned response, salivation. They now salivate to the sound of the bell. Now the thing with classical conditioning is the same response. You have a different stimulus that's generating the same response, okay? So much like with Pavlov's dog food made the dog salivate, the sound of the bell made the dog salivate. Classical conditioning is about giving the same response to a new stimulus. So I'll give you an example. I have a dog named Lady, and Lady, every day when I feed her, I open up her dog food bag and pour her dog food into her bowl, okay? And she drools, she salivates, okay? So dog food, salivate, just like Pavlov, okay? And then one day I noticed I was getting groceries out of the car, and I had all the grocery bags. And when I was getting the groceries out of the car, she was sitting there drooling. Okay, now why would she drool to me getting groceries out of the car? She associated the sound of the bags making noise or bags rattling with her dog food. Because so many times before, that sound of the dog food bag making noise and her dog food were paired. So now all it takes is for her to hear the sound of a bag rattling and she starts drooling. She thinks that means dog food. Okay, another student gave an example of their cat. They would feed their cat, put the cat food in the bowl, and the cat would come running. Put the cat food in the bowl, the cat would come running. Put the cat food in the bowl, the cat would come running. Unconditioned stimulus, cat food in the bowl. Unconditioned response, the cat would come running. Okay, so now the student says, all I have to do is run the can opener and the cat comes running. Why? Because so many times before, the food and the sound of the can opener were paired. Because this student used the can opener to open the cat's food. So the cat learned that can opener means I get food, so I'm going to go running to my cat food bowl. Okay? So conditioned stimulus, can opener. Conditioned response, the cat comes running. So it's the same response, but to a different stimulus, to a learned stimulus. Now, if you look on page 202, you'll see a diagram of Pavlov's experiment. I've also given you one in your PowerPoint lecture. And if you look on page 206, in the left-hand column, figure 6.7 is an experiment, a picture from an experiment called Little Albert and the White Rat. So maybe you've heard of this before, Little Albert and the White Rat, okay? John Watson was a behavioral psychologist who followed Pavlov's work and said, okay, Pavlov did that with his research with dogs, but can we do this with humans? And then Watson went a step further and he said, can we teach someone to fear? Can we teach someone to be afraid of something because it's paired with something else? Okay, so John Watson, and I've given you this video clip in your PowerPoint lecture. I've given you the video clip of John Watson's experiment with Little Albert and the White Rat. So make sure you watch that as an example of classical conditioning, teaching someone to be afraid. Okay, so John Watson had this little baby Albert, and little baby Albert was in an orphanage at the time, and this was the very first experiment that looked at classical conditioning with humans. So today this experiment could not be done. Ethical Review Board would say you cannot do that to a baby today, but back then, this was before there was an Ethical Review Board, so this experiment was conducted. Okay, and if you look on page 207 in the top right, you'll see little Albert all grown up. He actually passed away at the age of 87, and you'll see him in that picture on page 207. But let's get back to Little Albert and the White Rat, the experiment by John Watson. Okay, so John Watson brings in these animals into the room with little Albert. He brings in a puppy, he brings in a bunny, he brings in a monkey, he brings in a little white rat. And little Albert's just curious. He's curious about the puppy, the bunny, the monkey, the little white rat. John Watson wrote in his notes that little baby Albert was particularly interested in the little white rat. Okay, So he brings in these animals, and little Albert is not afraid of them. He is curious about them and actually leans over and reaches to pet some of them. So John Watson then takes the animals out, and he wants to see if little Albert is afraid of a loud banging noise. So he bangs a steel pipe with a hammer. He takes a hammer and he bangs the steel pipe, and it makes this really loud noise, and little Albert is frightened. He's startled and he's frightened. So John Watson knows little Albert is not afraid of the animals, but he is afraid of the loud noise. So the unconditioned stimulus, the loud noise, made little Albert feel afraid. So the unconditioned response is fear. The loud noise made little Albert afraid. Unconditioned stimulus, loud noise. Unconditioned response, fear. So John Watson says, what if I now bring the animals back in and pair the animals with the loud noise, with the thing little Albert is afraid of? Can I teach little Albert to then fear the animals? So that's exactly what he does. He brings in the puppy and he bangs and makes the loud noise. He brings in the bunny and makes the loud noise. He brings in the monkey and makes the loud noise. He brings in the little white rat and makes the loud noise. Little Albert, being afraid of the loud noise, is afraid each time he does this. So then he brings the animals in a third time, this time without the loud noise, and he wants to see if little Albert has learned to associate the animals with the loud noise, therefore fearing the animals. So he brings in the puppy, and little Albert's afraid. And he brings in the bunny, and little Albert's afraid. He brings in the monkey, and little Albert's afraid. He brings in the little white rat, and little Albert's afraid. So conditioned stimulus, the animals. Conditioned response, fear. Little Albert has learned to fear the animals just because they were paired with the thing he was afraid of, the loud noise. This is classical conditioning. Okay? Classical conditioning is our ability to associate things, to learn what goes with what. There's an example in your book about McDonald's French fries. So I don't know if any of you really like McDonald's French fries or not, but if you think about a food place that you like to go, food that you like to eat, coffee you like to drink, maybe you have a favorite drink or a favorite food, just that drink or that food may make you feel excited or feel your mouth water, like you really want to have that food or that drink. So in your book it says McDonald's French fries, so let's just use that. Okay, so maybe McDonald's French fries make your mouth water. Unconditioned stimulus, McDonald's French fries. Unconditioned response, your mouth waters. So over time, you eat these McDonald's French fries. Well, now all you need is just the McDonald's commercial, to see the McDonald's commercial, and your mouth waters for their French fries. Conditioned stimulus, McDonald's commercial. Conditioned response, your mouth waters. Okay? Same thing if you have a favorite place to go. Same thing if you remember someone for something. So earlier today in Adobe Connect Live, one of your classmates asked if it was the same with smell and memory, which is something we talked about last week, okay? And I gave the example to them that when I was growing up, my grandpa always made me feel safe and comforted and warm and happy. So unconditioned stimulus, my grandpa. Unconditioned response, happy, warm, comforted, safe. Well, my grandpa smoked a pipe when I was very young, not my whole life, but or not my whole childhood, but when I was very young. And so whenever I would smell that tobacco he used in his pipe, it makes me feel, or whenever I smell that now, it makes me feel warm and comforted and happy and safe. So unconditioned stimulus, my grandpa. Unconditioned response, warm, happy, safe, comforted. Conditioned response, conditioned stimulus, the tobacco that went in the pipe. Conditioned response, warm, safe, comforted, happy. So all I have to do is smell that tobacco that went in that pipe, and it makes me feel those same things. Why? Because the two were paired. My grandpa and the tobacco that he would smoke in his pipe. They were paired so many times that I learned to associate one with the other. That is classical conditioning. So think of your own examples of classical conditioning and use the Word document I've given you in your weekly folder that says it's titled Classical or Operant Conditioning. use those examples in that weekly folder to help you understand more of this type of